I want to start by just saying that we are at a historic inflection point that I think is akin to the aftermath of World War II, with so many interlocking crises that are forcing a rethink about the way the world functions. And I don't need to spend much time. We all know what they are: climate change, pandemics, increasing wars, geopolitical shifts, artificial intelligence. And I think what is difficult and scary is the fact that these crises are all transnational in nature and that we don't really have mechanisms to govern that, and B, that they are intersecting and overlapping with one another in such a way to make each other worse. So today, in 2023, there were 340 million people around the world in need of emergency aid, meaning that 1 in 23 people on this earth needed life-saving humanitarian assistance. And those numbers are exponentially higher than they used to be. So even as recently as 2019, the UN deemed 120 million people to be in need. So we're seeing almost a tripling in just 4 years. And the amount of money that's needed to help those people in need has also skyrocketed. So 20 years ago, the UN appealed for $1 billion to help people in need. And in 2023, it was $50 billion. So a 50 times increase in 2 decades. And even as every year the money to help people increases, so too does the gap between the money available and the needs. And every year, almost half of the people in need don't get the help they need. So that's just a bit of the landscape that we're operating in this very unique time. And I often think of humanitarians as kind of being on hamster wheels, where they're just desperately trying to keep up. Or to use another terrible analogy, it kind of feels like whack-a-mole, right? Like you knock one crisis down and then another one pops up. And then add on top of that we're seeing, particularly now in Gaza, just the normalization of violations of the laws of war in such a brutal and shocking way. So what is clear to me is that the world cannot keep handling crises the way that we used to. And the work of humanitarian response that has typically been the domain of governments, of the UN, of international NGOs, is now opening up to other players. And that's where I think people in this room come in. Some of you may not have historically seen yourselves as operating in the crisis space, but the reality is that either you are about to, or you might want to think about doing so. And so what we've done today is to assemble people who have experience responding to crises, to help you start to think about either should you start operating in this space, or how do you continue being able to pursue the impact that you're driving in the midst of the crises that surround us. So with that, I'm going to introduce you to our panelists. To my left is Tjada McKenna, excuse me, who's the CEO of Mercy Corps, which describes itself as a group of humanitarians who create a future where everyone can prosper. And I note that because it's a very unusual way for a humanitarian organization to think, which is not just what are the immediate needs, but how do we also help people in the long term. Next to her is Shamil Idriss, who's the CEO of Search for Common Ground, which is a peace-building organization that operates in conflict zones in particular around the world. And finally, Binaifer Nowrojee, who is soon to be taking over as president of Open Society Foundation's, OSF being one of the few philanthropies that does engage in the crisis space. So I'd like to start at a macro level and then look at what each of these institutions are doing and then look at what you in the room can do. And so to start off, want to talk a little bit about, in this particular moment that we find ourselves in, what is the paradigm shift that you think is needed to meet this moment? And I'm going to start with you, Shamil, if I can.
Great. No, thank you. And thank you for all attending here and online. There are 5 paradigm shifts that I think we need to accept. The first is to recognize that more so than any other time in history, these crises are entirely preventable. It is not the case that there's anything inevitable, particularly when you realize the fact that 15 years ago, if you gave $1 to a humanitarian organization, 80 cents on that dollar would have gone to victims of natural disasters or pandemics or whatever it might be. Today, more than 80 cents on that dollar has to go to victims of violent conflict. And when we recognize that most of these crises are fueled by violent conflict, we understand that they are indeed preventable. And there are multiple cases. The mobilization during the war in Sri Lanka across ethnic and religious lines laid the basis for a network that prevented reprisal killings years later after the Easter Sunday bombings in 2019, that prevented mass atrocities and a possible descent back into war. The work done with Sudanese women and activists across the country in the middle of this war has been one of the reasons that, very underreported, Sudanese people have resisted the efforts of both armed groups to recruit them into an ethnic war rather than what is really a war between two armed groups for power in the country. And you can go on and on and on in the ways that an entire humanitarian crisis can either be prevented or at least prevented from getting worse in almost every case that we look at. The second paradigm shift is to recognize not only is it the case that don't think that you can only do less in the humanitarian crisis. The fact is, unfortunately, that breakthroughs only become possible oftentimes after breakdowns. And so it's actually the case that in the midst of crisis, oftentimes much more is possible, even though people get very risk averse and tend to pull back or start to reassess. If you look at the fact that after an earthquake, we tend to build the buildings that we should have built before the earthquake, or after a pandemic, we develop the vaccines that we wish we had developed before the pandemic. After violent conflict triggers a humanitarian crisis, we should be investing in the kinds of intercommunal work that can prevent the next humanitarian crisis, conflict-driven crisis. The third and fourth paradigm shifts, one goes to the community level, the other goes to the political level. If you're going to do that kind of work that doesn't just cope with problems but solves them, so it addresses the current crisis in a way that prevents the next one, it's critical to support not just local activism. I know that's the biggest trend and it's an important one in philanthropy, but I would call it multi-partial activism. What do I mean by that? Local activists that are not only from the communities that specifically draw from across the conflict lines in that society. That work that I mentioned in Sri Lanka only became possible because it was Sinhalese, Buddhist, Muslim, and Tamil activists who had worked together during the war who were able to mobilize with unique credibility. Work done in Burundi after the genocide in Rwanda, little told story about why there wasn't a genocide in neighboring Burundi. The same plane crash that killed the Rwandan president that triggered that genocide also killed the Burundian president and triggered ethnic violence in Burundi. But it was a very courageous group of Hutu and Tutsi Burundians who created the first multi-ethnic staffed media outlet in the entire Great Lakes region of Africa that helped to prevent, and they were credited with preventing genocide many years later by then Secretary of State Kerry. So at the community level, yes, fund local if you're a philanthropist, but recognize, and this is also on your teams, if you have a funding office in Nigeria and 95% of your staff are Christian in a country that is the 5th largest Muslim country in the world, recognize that that's really going to skew what you're doing. So yes, support local, but also support multi-partial. At the political level, the fourth paradigm is to replace isolation with engagement and humanitarian diplomacy. You see criticisms all the time, the Neville Chamberlain argument, whatever you think of Erdogan and what he's doing in Turkey, if he didn't maintain the relationship with Putin to negotiate the Odessa grain deal, we wouldn't have been able to prevent famine in much of Africa. It looks hopeful that another deal will be hopefully agreed to soon. We see in Gaza, 3 hostages that we know about have been killed by the IDF military action, 3 have been rescued, and over 100 have been released as a result of negotiations facilitated largely by Qatar. Engagement and humanitarian diplomacy can either prevent or greatly alleviate suffering even in the midst of violent conflict. Isolation tends to drive us in the other direction. And the fifth is to really, the fifth paradigm is to recognize, embrace, support the most powerful actors that you see today that are different from the ones that tended to be embraced and recognized in the 20th century. So that includes as I said, those multi-partial teams, the Malian youth activists mobilizing to prevent the recruitment into extremist groups through online platforms. The Nigerian radio producers who were credited less than a year ago with more than 50% of the Boko Haram defectees, the people who left the movement, credited this radio programming with changing their minds and getting them to lay down their weapons. At the political level, the examples I just gave are not the 20th century usual suspects of Switzerland and Norway. They're still there, but it's Qatar, it was Turkey, it's Kenya, it's South Africa, it's the so-called middle powers. And that leads to my last thing, which is not so much, so these going through those five, it's recognize this is preventable, recognize that you can oftentimes do more, not less, in the middle of crises, because sometimes dynamics that have been stuck can finally be unstuck. At the community level, support not just local, but multi-partial activism. At the political level, replace isolation with engagement in humanitarian diplomacy. And recognize and support those actors, both at the local and political level, who have constituency and influence today. Frankly, always had it, but they weren't recognized in the 20th century. The last thing is that on this last piece, we have to also recognize the international community should not be creating humanitarian crises, which is different from saying prevent them. In Afghanistan now, more than 20 million Afghans are now aid dependent. That is entirely a result of the sanctions on Afghanistan. Entirely the result of the sanctions on Afghanistan. Not the Taliban rule as much as the sanctions on Afghanistan. And you can say all we need to say about the Taliban rule. The desire to not deal with leadership in Venezuela or Afghanistan or whatever it might be tends to use these blunt instruments of sanctions that actually victimize millions of regular citizens who don't have the option to flee or don't want to flee. So while we're doing these other five things, I think we need to recognize that there are times when the international community actually creates these crises and not just struggles to meet them.
Let's go well beyond sanctions in Afghanistan and look at what the Security Council is doing in Gaza, which is clearly worsening the situation. Tjada, Shamil talked about the work at the local level and that more is possible and that you can actually invest in making things better, even in the midst of crises. That's something Mercy Corps does a lot of. What are the paradigm shifts that you think are necessary?
I think you framed it well when you started, Heba, and that the reality is that conflict, poverty, and the effects of climate change go hand in hand. So what we're seeing is what we thought of before as the disasters of the flood or the hurricane or the fires in North America. They're coming closer together, they're more extreme, they're more severe, but those situations of fighting for resources also are the places where people are able to be kind of split apart the most, where there's that competition for resources, where bad actors can be bad influences, and it's also just goes hand in hand with poverty. So the way that we think about it, and that's why our tagline is where all can prosper, is we really think about long-term resilience and helping communities to build those. And yes, there are things in the short term that people need and that we know how to do. What's really the long term? And for us, when things are the roughest, where do you turn to? Your local community. So I think the paradigm had already shifted from people just sending like their unwanted high heels and winter coats to Haiti to a movement towards cash and things. We really work deeply. We tend to be in the communities. Like we've been in Gaza and Gaza and the West Bank since the 80s. The same Sudan, we've been there since 90. So long term, but what that looks like is working in the local partnership. Ukraine is actually our first emergency where we're working 100% through local partners. And the reality is what we know from doing this in lots of different instances, that local organizations that may do things slightly different, we understand the increases in gender-based violence. We understand the increased risk of trafficking and safeguarding. Like we understand how kind of bad people take advantage of these situations. So with our local partners, a lot of what we're doing with local partners is like equipping them for training or ways to look out, like kind of preparing them for what may come. And then also working with them, like what is appropriate for this community? Like how do you work together? What are the right ways to message this? Helping them to tailor their products to really think of those who are the most marginalized in emergencies, right? Like as local organizations, we all have the same local biases that everyone else does. So, maybe tailoring products to specifically address needs of certain populations that weren't their clients before. So it really, I think the paradigm shift is really thinking about the different layers of the community, different income levels, being prepared to shift to support them. We very much desperately work to support local markets. So in most emergencies, we are one of the leaders of cash consortiums. Gaza is a very unfortunate situation where the local market has just been destroyed, but we still have been able to do cash where there are functioning local markets. Working at that. The second thing is to think about these as, these are protracted, right? We have all kinds of, the number of migrants and displaced people in the world it's at an all-time high. I don't remember the exact number. It will continue as people kind of leave these situations or forced out. And so that is why it is a long-term situation. And in the global north, there's a bit of fatigue, right? People can only hold so much at once. And we're also fighting a tide of isolationism at the same time. So I think being attuned to the long-term nature, especially for donors and funders and local actors or businesses that have things to provide, just being built for the long haul and the back and forth of these is the great paradigm shift. The final thing is there really is a need at the global level to look bigger picture. The flood of disinformation, there are a lot of, we're in a multipolar world, as it just was pointing out, of different people, different nations having views, but there's a lot of opportunity to use all of these as proxy wars, right? So we see that as a path beyond lots of the tides to pull people further and further apart.
One of the things that's so depressing in our work at the New Humanitarian is that, you see the attention go from one crisis. So it's all, Ukraine is all the rage, and then a new crisis comes along, and now Ukraine of all crises has been forgotten, and it's Gaza, and then you watch as Gaza slips out of the headlines, and it's...
and that Sudan never gets to come to the forefront. Yeah.
Bin, what's your take on the big shifts that are needed to meet the moment?
So it's a strange moment where there's multiple different things shifting. So the first is you have all these various crises where you can't fix things nationally alone because there's connections, pandemic, climate, etc. But at the same time, I think what COVID showed us, at the end of the day, you're at the mercy of your own government to live or die, and that nationalism still plays a role, and that who you are and which country you're in will also determine things. And so working in that space, it's almost as if you have to play on different chessboards simultaneously if you want to untie this thing. And to me then, when you're looking, and I come from a philanthropic background, I started my work at Human Rights Watch. I was a documenter of violations in war situations. And there I would write my report, and then I would go to policymakers and beg them to pay attention to something or the other. I moved into philanthropy, and I work for Open Society Foundations now, which is largely a donor and an advocate, but is willing to take risks. And so it's very unusual in the philanthropy space. And I think it's what I saw is the ability to do things quite differently in this space of open society. So the first thing is that none of these conflicts come as a surprise to those who are close to them. They have many years in the build-up, and how those warning signs are paid attention to is really, I think, a question, and what should be done at the get-go in terms of dealing with the cause, not just the effect after the fact. And philanthropy can work at all those levels. And I think, to be in this business, you need to be a perpetual optimist. And Shamil is right. In every space, wherever you are, there's an opportunity and there's a chance to do something. It's just in conflict, you are really kind of seeing the worst of humanity. So it seems very hopeless, but there's always somewhere. There's always the urgent and the long term, again, on these chessboards, working with peace building, stopping conflict, getting things. But then long term, because these societies are all contested, and the investment to bring them to something that's stable in the long term is really the task, a long-term task. It can't be done in that moment of crisis alone. We step in where governments fall short, but it's not something we like to do. We're not humanitarian aid. But in a lot of places, what we're seeing, our governments themselves are contested. You see these election votes coming in at the 50% mark. And so even governments that want to give aid or have been traditionally aid givers themselves it's harder and harder to get bilateral or other funds to step to address it. And so contested political spaces are not just the province of conflict. We're seeing it now everywhere. The other thing that I think is, again, it's also been mentioned, but these kind of coalitions of the unlikely, these new actors, these new spaces, the Qataris, the Kenyans, the fact that African presidents showed up in Ukraine, the fact that Gambia and South Africa are the ones bringing cases to the International Court of Justice. These are new developments, and they signal new pathways for all of us. And the last thing I'll say is that, I mean, when I look at places of energy, places of passion, I really feel the future is with young women from Global South. I feel like that's where I see really a spot of hope. And why? Why is that? I see the energy in young, the youth. In women, this is the first time we're going to have more women going to university than men ever in the history. And I think that's going to have implications over the next 10 years. You're going to see what that's going to bring. It may be for better or worse, we don't know. But, and where's the demographic bulge? The demographic bulge is now in that middle global, majority global South. So the numbers are with young women, global South, and I see that's where they're gonna come up with the new paradigms and solutions that will help us to get where we need to be.
I like the optimism. And I would just add my, my kind of thoughts on the paradigm shift question, picking up from your point on the coalitions of the unlikely. And I think one of the things that we need when we listen to all of you talking about the need to think more long-term, the need to be more preventative, et cetera, is shifts in our multilateralism. And Mary Robinson talked about it yesterday. And that if we have a global governance system where a handful of powerful countries get to decide for everyone else, you're just never going to have, like what you're saying, right? The crises are being created by those for whom it serves. And so that, to me, feels like one of the big paradigm shifts that needs to happen. But sticking with you, Ben, you said OSF is willing to take risks, and that strikes me because at least in the humanitarian world, we always hear, oh, philanthropy are the risk takers, right? And it's the governments that don't take risk, and philanthropy is here to do that. And yet, we don't really see many philanthropists in the crisis space. OSF has this notion of patient versus urgent capital, and you referred to that slightly. And George Soros's vision was always that critical thinking, local knowledge, and risk-taking can combine to be really powerful, but how does that apply in times of crisis? And how do you think about, how to be able to mobilize quickly when a crisis hits while maintaining that kind of overall added value that philanthropy is supposed to be able to bring?
So I think that's the advantage of philanthropy. It doesn't have the scale of government, but it has the ability to move fast or to stay or get out as it chooses without the sort of whims of a changing government. And there you can mobilize quickly. Open society is in every region in the world. And that also, we have staff hired from places, in places, sitting in those spaces. And so they have an understanding of the context. And I think that when you're working, we can all aspire for sort of global values, but actually implementing depends very much on having a contextual knowledge of a place as to how you actually navigate it through to the end point. And that's where having staff who are from a region advising us how to proceed is good. The other thing we have in our philanthropy, because of George Soros, again, being the donor, is really a lot of access to either governments, people in power, to be able to advocate and use that sort of bully pulpit to raise issues. And a lot of our work as staff at Open Society involves either accessing places that could make change or assisting our grantees to actually be able to access those spaces, voices, etc.
May I add to that really quickly? I think one of the things that we try to encourage with funders, a lot of funders, they want to fund things or places where they can visit, right? Or where they can get the pictures. And I think there's a natural fear of conflict zones. And even the US government is much better at supporting like when the emergency hits versus long term. And so we really tried to encourage donors to kind of break out of those silos of categorizing things in that way. and to know that you have so many people that are living in conflict areas right now who are the most left behind. But those people they're there. There are communities there that are working. There are great stories of the people's ability to thrive, and so to really help people think beyond humanitarian or development, because they're blending into one, or conflict or non-conflict, they're going to evolve, and to just think about where you can help the people most in need, and those are conflict environments.
But I think one of the other challenges with philanthropy is often, and sorry, now you've become the target of all the philanthropy criticisms, but is that often they want to work in areas where they can show impact, where they can show progress. And so the hopeless cases are not interesting because you won't have a good story to tell at the end of it.
And we have good individual stories, and that's where, so the data, the being a slave to data, well, okay, we'll stop.
It's actually, if I may have that, it's actually a misnomer, both that they're hopeless and that the impact isn't actually quite powerful. I'm not just saying this because we're at the Skoll Forum, but I'll give you two quick stories. If you were at the opening event last night and you saw that lovely thing where they paired some of us with other Skoll members of the community, and there was a young woman from Afghanistan who spoke. She's the only Afghan woman to lead an international NGO in that country today. And under her leadership, the programming has tripled in size since the Taliban took over. And the only reason that she still has a job and that team is still there is because the Skoll Foundation provided an emergency grant of a very modest size, less than $100,000, right after the Taliban took over, to ensure that we could keep the team on the ground. They now are the backbone support to the largest local network of civil society organizations in the country, over 100, as a result of that. The second story comes from Sudan, where for the last 7 years, that network of Sudanese women, local community-based mediators in their own communities, when the war broke out, it was again the Skoll Foundation, and this is the only foundation we've had the experience with. The Open Road Alliance also exists for this purpose, but the Skoll Foundation has always been the quickest to move on this. They provided an emergency grant of even less, I think it was $25,000, to ensure that those women could be kept secure and that we could move them to safer place in their own country. Fast forward just a couple months later, the peace talks that eventually collapsed in Tjada, somebody reached out to us and said, there is not a single woman, this is totally, I don't have to tell you all, this is so typical, there's not a single woman, not only on any of the negotiation the parties to the negotiation, but the negotiation facilitation teams from the US government and the UN didn't have a single woman in them. And there's no mechanism for inviting women's participation or input. And so this network of women in Sudan developed a framework that someone close to us then translated and got accepted at the highest levels of the negotiation facilitators. The Tjada talks then collapsed, but whenever negotiations open up again, there is a framework for Sudanese women across the country to have legitimate and direct input into the negotiations. Couldn't get them at the table exactly, but this is a total investment of less than $150,000 for both that, and this is what I mean by the fact that actually there are often, not just sometimes, opportunities to do things that actually have significant impact because there's been a breakdown. And suddenly people are thinking, we've got to find a better way to do this, or we have to figure out a way. When that Taliban takeover happened, and I talked to our director there as it was going on, the first thing she said is, we have to stay. Please support us to stay, because things will shift in ways we can't predict. And if you leave when they shift, you're not going to get back in. And that's the reality. So these situations, not only are they not hopeless, I don't want to be Pollyannish about the level of human suffering, because you outlined it, and it's unprecedented globally. And at the same time, I really want the message, particularly for the philanthropists in the room, and there are a lot more of you than the government people in the room, what you can do by doubling down in those moments in very specific and timely and unrestricted ways is beyond the level of impact you're likely to achieve, even in more stable times.
A lot of that, however, or instead of but and, depends on knowing who the local players are in advance of the crisis, so that when the crisis hits, you can act fast. And Tjada, Mercy Corps is very good at doing that. Can you give us some tips for how you go about building those partnerships and relationships before you need to activate them?
So 90% of our staff is actually from the communities where we serve, and I've increasingly been pushing for those to be the country directors and the top levels as well. to make sure that there's an equity within the organization. But that really helps us to develop relationships with people that are in the communities we serve. We tend to be in the more difficult to reach places. And there's also this, there's a lot of in and out. I was at a forum yesterday, and I was discouraging people from thinking that it's like local, international. It's both, right? And I think in all of our organizations, you see a disaster comes and like your top employees get poached by the UN, or people come in and out of different places. And those are people that are really set up to be leaders in these times, and knowing like who's doing good work or who the community trusts. And then it's also listening to the communities and saying, who have you gone to for this or for that? And also, like, sometimes people will pick a bad partner. And so really understanding when that happens, spotting it, listening to people when you're getting feedback, and really being able to work alongside, because they're just really different gifts and skills that all these players bring to different situations, that can come together in beautiful, very impactful ways when done well.
Different skills and experiences that can come together. Shamil, Search for Common Ground recently struck a partnership with the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. And at the time it was announced, you said the solution is more creative engagement. And I think it is much harder than it seems to strike these kinds of partnerships, because there are just totally different ways of operating, both from an international NGO to a local organization, but also from an international NGO to a UN agency. So if this is to serve as some kind of model for how unlikely partnerships can help address these rising crises, what have you learned in terms of do's and don'ts around striking partnerships to meet this moment?
So that
and
partnership,
please be honest with us, because Martin Griffiths left, so you can say whatever you want now.
He's not out yet.
He's not out.
I was going to say, he has a few more months.
He'll leave on July 1. So interesting thing about Martin, Martin is the UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, so sort of the highest ranking humanitarian official in the world, and oversees the OCHA, the humanitarian response everywhere. Martin doesn't come out of a humanitarian background. He comes out of a conflict background. He's a creative thinker around conflict dynamics. He reached out to me, let me tell you the story very briefly, because this is typical of, again, we all have a role to play, and the international system, as Mary Robinson and Zaid Hussein mentioned up from the stage yesterday, is clearly crumbling. But as Mary Robinson said, kind of paraphrasing Churchill, it's the worst possible system except compared to all the others. And you really, before you tear something down, you better have something of at least equal value in its place, or recognize what a full teardown means, which in this context means World War III. So Martin reached out and he said, look, he's somebody who recognizes that the UN wasn't established to be the world's largest humanitarian response agency. It was established as a political entity to prevent war and foster cooperation on the world's biggest problems. And for all the failings of the UN, it actually has had great successes. The latter half of the last century, the levels of violent conflict globally went down to the lowest levels in recorded history. And we're still living at this time in the longest period since recorded history going back to 1500 without a war between the so-called great powers, which was the original reason for creating the UN.
Well, except that they're fighting through proxies.
Yes, absolutely. But we have to be serious about that. The last 20 years, we've seen a rise every single year in the level of violent conflict, and as a result, a rise in humanitarian needs. But from 1950 until the turn of this, actually until 2010, levels of violent conflict on both a per capita and an aggregate basis, so even adjusting for population growth, came down, were dropping. That's not to minimize the genocide in Rwanda or anything that was happening, but we can't just throw out the baby with the, or just say, hey, it's all hell. So he reached out and he said, look, he established this humanitarian negotiation unit within that body. And he said, I deploy these people to deal with violent groups or authorities that are on bad terms with the international community. So Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, or authorities like the Taliban deploys these negotiators. And he said, in the case of a mutual friend who serves on our advisory board, who's one of those negotiators, he said, let me tell you 2 stories, but I could tell you 50, and then I have a proposition. He said, every time I want to deploy Tom, this system requires 21 days to issue his plane ticket. because of the nature of the contract and how the UN works. Even though Martin is the third most senior person in the UN system, he can't make it move faster than that. He said, I've never wanted to deploy him in more than 2 days, because it's either for a crisis or an opportunity. Second story, the last time he was in Kabul, Tom was in Kabul, he said he called me and said that arguably the most important official in the Taliban government invited him to stay at his compound. And Tom called me, and Martin's relaying the story to me, and I said, you have to do this. This is 15 years of trust building come to fruition. They were talking about a lot of things that everyone would want to have talked about with those authorities. So he said, you have to do this. Tom hangs up, but the mission on the ground wouldn't allow him to travel outside of their security protocols. So he went back to his 5-star hotel. So Martin said, my proposal to you is this, that we pilot something where you all hire this negotiator 95% of his time, but he has a 1 or 2 day a month contract with my office. He travels according to your policies and procedures, which are a lot more flexible and adaptive than ours, but he goes under my auspices, so he has the access and the influence that he needs to negotiate. We're very early on in that, and now Martin, for very personal reasons, is having to step aside, so I'm hopeful that this will, from here I'm going to see the lead humanitarian person in Oslo to see if we can not only solidify this, but actually expand it. But the last piece of this story goes to philanthropists. I immediately called the 2 governments that I thought would be most likely to understand the worst case scenario of this arrangement is that hundreds of thousands of people in need will have access secured or maintained for humanitarian response. That's the worst case. The best case, and this is really where Martin's coming from, is that when you engage in negotiations like that, you sometimes identify political opportunities that, if handled right, could alleviate or even lift that situation out of the crisis. You build relationships with the leadership of these groups. You identify opportunities that are much more likely than sanctions to lead to an end to the crisis. And so I called these governments, and just as you were saying, they're just too slow moving, and it was actually 3 foundations, Packard Foundation, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and Hilton Foundation. I want to give them the credit they're due, who just each put in a very modest amount to enable this. That's another space where philanthropy should be the risk capital. That then when you have the demonstration case, you can go to the governments and say, see, this works, now come in, to provide a much more secure, basis for it. So what we've learned from this, it's too early, honestly, to say, but already the things that they've been able to do, even in these last couple months of that partnership, are quicker and more flexible and adaptive than what they could do before.
But what I take away from that is, or the smart thing there is, they figured out their limitations. They said, we know we need to operate in this area, and they found the partner that has the access, that has the agility, and then enabled them to do their work, which can apply in many other contexts. And I want to shift now to, for the folks in this room, how many of you actually operate in crisis zones? Okay. How many of you are not operating now, but thinking about it? How many of you consider yourselves to have nothing to do with crisis? Okay. So your answers are throwing me off my game, because my assumption was that you don't operate in crises, and you should, and that we should give you advice for how to do so. But I think we'll get to your questions in a minute, and then you can kind of make sure this is useful for you. For those, if we are to consider that the majority of social innovators are not purely focused on crisis response, and for that matter, the majority of philanthropists, although you've given some good examples, but Ben, you've mentioned that it isn't the typical practice. What do they need to know when entering into this space or trying to operate in this space? And maybe we can start with you, Ben, from a philanthropy perspective. How do you set yourself up as a philanthropist, and to the extent you can get a bit technical or nerdy about this, like what are the internal mechanisms that you need to have in place that allow you to be able to respond when a crisis hits, and what advice would you give to those funders who don't consider themselves to be crisis funders? You've responded to Myanmar, Ukraine, Gaza. Like, how did that work, and what did you learn from that?
So I think there's the fast and the slow, right? The immediate and crisis and responding. And a lot of times, I would say the best interventions are with programs or people or organizations that have been there before the conflict starts, as opposed to kind of entering at the late game. And this is, again, one of the problems where there's sort of a flavor of the month conflict, and then everybody descends on it. And then within 5-6 years, they abandon it for the next one. And the other thing I would say is that you really want to avoid a kind of plug-and-play type of approach. And you do find people going from conflict to conflict, but the ability to unlock a conflict completely really depends on a kind of deep knowledge of a place to be able to understand what's going to make it tick. Yes, there's some generics, but being able to identify what are the power dynamics, who are the personalities, but it is also a skill, the conflict resolution negotiation, and there are people who are better skilled at it than others. And there's not equality of all groups being equal in that skill set in this field. So identifying which ones actually are better placed for which places. And then I would say that everybody is in a crisis situation, everybody's pivoting to meet that moment, including local groups, including local people, politicians, et cetera, and those dynamics move fast. But even as you're moving into the crisis, you're going to have to think, what is the post-crisis situation going to look like? Should we be putting a new constitution on the table for this one? Should we be doing a kind of divided, federated line? Should we be doing, what actually is the end game here of this conflict that could get us actually, dig us out of it? And then also be able to start funding the seeds of that, so that at that moment, and that moment will come, you will actually be poised for it. The other thing is conflict creates displacement, and a lot of talent is outside, either in refugee camps or outside the country. How do you mobilize that? How do you actually engage it? And so to think about that. And for philanthropies that are not going into crisis situations, refugee flows and forced displacement is almost always a consequence, and that's a place that philanthropists can move more easily if you can't resolve a conflict or you're not in conflict. There are many refugee rights issues, many ways in which you can support for people who've been forcibly displaced.
But if we take Gaza as an example, and I've heard surprisingly little about Gaza at Skoll, actually, which is notable and makes me question. For conflict that is so intractable, or seen to be so intractable, that is very political, and for which some philanthropists won't want to touch, what do where do you start if you want to? What's the entry point? And when you say, already be thinking post-crisis on a crisis like that, how do you even?
So OSF's been working in Israel, Gaza for 20 years. So we have a lot of relationships in terms of supporting groups for decades. So rights groups, Palestinian and Israeli both. And so there are long relationships, and so that you can build on. We also are looking at the issue in a kind of multifaceted way. It's not single. So again, in complex spaces, you kind of divide up and see where is it that you can actually make influence or have influence, and think through. But I think that we're talking about a system that's being dismantled. It's being dismantled by the very people who are advocating for it. It's the hypocrisy of the West in dealing with Ukraine versus Gaza that itself is damaging the international system and is normalizing violations that we've not seen before. So it's not just about Israel and Gaza. This is about something bigger as well, about where we stand on international norms. And the very people who advocate, who claim that they are the advocates for this values-based, laws-based system, are the very ones who are weakening it. And so that also needs to be spoken about in ways that actually can salvage the good parts of what we have. Now you see in this multipolar world also other voices that didn't have muscle and to speak, that are saying the right thing, that are speaking up. And we've mentioned a few of these other actors that are coming up. Those voices need to be encouraged as well. If these are global standards, there can't just be a few keepers of them. There has to be, so we need to encourage those other alternate voices. and kind of this assumption that only the West can bring the values-based, rules-based order, and everybody else, if it was in their hands, it would somehow all go down the drain. I think looking at the way we are in the world, we really have to question that assumption. It may be that the saviors of the world order and the rules-based order are going to come from elsewhere.
So everything that I shared in terms of the paradigm shifts and the examples that I gave is directly relevant to that conflict as well. The fact that if a crisis breaks out and you're thinking, gee, I wish I had, if you're a philanthropist and you're thinking, I wish I had invested in this or that 5 years ago or 10 years ago, then do it now. We are, I would argue with anybody that there's a greater likelihood now that there will be an actual political process, which is the main thing that has been lacking for the last 20 years on this conflict, than there was on October 6th. Because enough parties, mainly within Israel, some Arab states engaged in the Abraham Accords, key capitals like Washington, D.C., had convinced themselves that they didn't have to deal with this politically, or that it could just be sort of maintained, and at least, with all of what's happened right now, there's no, I'm not saying it's likely, it's not. It's going to require a great deal of effort to mobilize the political will and ultimately the popular support for a real political resolution to this, not just to the end of this war, but the transformation of the overall conflict. And that's why now is actually the moment to engage. Similarly, multi-partial activism is critical. It's all well and good to allow yourself and be selectively empathetic to the community that you feel most connected to, and people are vicariously traumatized by this conflict and everywhere. I talked to a Burkina Faso staff member in November. This is what they wanted to talk about. We did an impact trip to Kenya, and our regional director from Zimbabwe talked about how polarized Zimbabwe was on this conflict. This resonates in a different kind of way, and that makes it oftentimes more difficult to actually mobilize what is going to be required, which is to mobilize those who actually have constituency. Anytime you're going to try and advance a genuine politically viable peace process, you need leadership that has constituency. And when you're in the middle of what's going on right now, the constituency has moved very far to the extremes for very understandable reasons. And it's very easy to think, well, we just need to condemn the right people or what, and we'll be able to get the progress that we need. We have to start now to run a 20-year marathon. In our experience, and I think if you look historically, to get to a political agreement that has enough political will and popular support to stay, there will always be detractors, takes a generation after mass violence. And that's without another outbreak of mass violence in the interim period. So it's like you need to initiate right now and support those on the ground, Israelis and Palestinians, as well as mobilize the political pressure and inducements from the Americans and others to get that process started now, understanding that when this war finally ends, we'll be at the beginning point of a 20-year marathon. But all of the principles that I shared are directly relevant. And there's nothing unique about this conflict that makes it impervious to resolution. You take any conflict and you refuse to have a political process that engages one of the parties to the conflict for 20 years, it's going to explode.
So one of the things that we've not, Tjada, one of the things we've not talked about a lot is the issue of justice, because in all of these crisis situations, there's always that tension to try and get to peace at the expense of justice. And I think there is, again, a role for philanthropy. We do a lot of funding in conflict places on documentation of violations very early on, collection of evidence. We have a strategic litigation department that works around some of the cases that get brought. How do you bring strong cases, either national, regional, or international level? And that's a place where, again, you're building for the long term because you want to build an understanding that these things are not acceptable. These things are violations. You want to give the assurance to victims that what's been done to them is wrong. But also over time, as we build an international justice system, and it's very early days for that in the scheme of things, and so it's still not a strong, robust system like a national judicial system, but we are, with each case, building something that will actually, hopefully, build into the future where there's accountability and that people who are committing these violations eventually think twice about it. Right now, I think we've got a very nascent international justice system, but this is something, again, a place to invest.
So just on a practical level, in terms of the entrepreneurs in the room.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, because we've given a lot of advice to the philanthropists.
Yeah, in terms of the entrepreneurs and the artists in the room, over half of Gaza's housing stock has been destroyed. People have now had to live under a siege with no access to electricity, running water. For a while, there were some SIM cards coming in that bypassed the local systems where people could still get out using an Egyptian process. I think there are lots of other things people may be able to do, or tools to give people to endure long sieges. So we know what's happened during this war. I think there are products and services that can help people. Unfortunately, if there is a next time, lots of rebuilding to be done. There are lots of entrepreneurial, very educated people in Gaza. We were running a longstanding program in partnership with Google called Gaza Sky Geeks that had trained generations of coders and web people. We need people to go in and tell the stories, right? We need to keep this front of mind. And there's a very powerful and wonderful Palestinian diaspora that's also desperate to engage in this process with a lot of skills that it brings to bear. So it is the writers to help document these things. But I think every segment is needed to work alongside Gazans to rebuild the future for their children.
I want to hand over to the audience for your questions. So if you can raise your hands and wait for the mics. And I see 2 hands here and then one in the corner.
Now, finally, we can see you with the lights on. It was very dark out there.
So maybe just right here to start.
Hi, thank you all so much. I came to the session specifically because of Innovating in the title, and really appreciate all of the great insights you all have shared. Just as a little bit of context, I'm a humanitarian. I work for an organization called ALIGHT, formerly known as the American Refugee Committee. We work in crisis zones and conflict, people displaced by climate. And I've been working in this sector for the last year. Prior to that, I worked in philanthropic infrastructure for a decade, helping philanthropy decide or have the information on who's funding what, when, and what, where, and why, so that they can make informed decisions. And as someone who intentionally chose to work in the humanitarian space, it has been incredibly rewarding and incredibly challenging in many, many ways. And so my view of having that background of working in philanthropic infrastructure and now being involved in direct service is that the humanitarian sector in many ways doesn't have the flexibility to innovate in the way that we truly want to, and a lot of that has to do with power dynamics and the funding and resources that we need. So my question to you all is what is that practical advice? I mean, there's funders till this day that our sector is very grateful for their support for, that give us 7% indirect funding to support our work. And so just a general question of what are grant makers doing about this, and what are some practical tips that INGO, especially humanitarian organizations, can implement to get more fuel to fund this innovation that we're all seeking to do.
Meaning, how do you get around the constraints in that you don't have enough core
How do you
funding
deal
to
with
be
the
able-
power dynamics? How do we make humanitarian organizations feel more comfortable asking for more, because we're constantly making trade-offs?
Yeah. Okay.
So, yeah.
Could you pass the mic to the person right here? And then we'll just take that question too. Thanks.
Thank you. Helena from the Nobel Peace Center. I wanted to ask if you could expand a bit on your thoughts on investing into international justice system. I was wondering if you were thinking in terms of universal jurisdiction, or the need to include gender apartheid in the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty. Where are the exciting areas that should be taken forward for all of us in this room? Thank you.
Tjada, do you want to tackle the innovation question?
Yeah, so that's where the private philanthropy and also private donor funding really helps. So, for instance, we've been testing the use of blockchain to use for mobile identification for migrant populations on the move. we've been able to set up crisis analytics units in our different regions and in different specific countries where we're able to kind of take data remotely, also from the ground, to kind of help facilitate better movement during crisis, better predictive. When Russia invaded Ukraine, we were out the following week with what the effect of food prices would be in Lebanon as a result, and able to then tailor our programming to that. So I think that's one of the things as an international organization, kind of leveraging some of that global north access and technology, and being able to work with tech companies to really look at the next generation of innovation. I guess the other thing for entrepreneurs, I think, or for anyone looking to work in the region, I think talking to organizations like ours about why there's this desire to think that, not to be blunt, but to think that we've been stupid or have overlooked things as to why certain things aren't done a certain way. And when you talk to us, there are things we might say like, we can't do that because of U.S. government anti-terrorism rules or da-da-da-da, but this is, and I think that's kind of where Martin went to you with that advice, or like, these are the pitfalls in that system, or this, to kind of help navigate what tends to work, what doesn't work, and also what we know about those local contexts. But and that's why it gets to telling the stories, obviously urging for that more flexible funding in these situations, because we've got to be able to just try these things and test them. And then also still encouraging people to invest in some of the research and the data connection and testing of new things. Because the reality is we are going to have to do more with less. It just the nature of the problem, but kind of allowing us the space to maneuver. So begging philanthropists for that, and then where we can find it, figuring out how to augment that in different ways.
But presumably also, not that humanitarian organizations shouldn't be trying to innovate, but that's where some of the social entrepreneurs can come into the picture, right? Where humanitarian organizations are limited in what they can do. And what would you say to social entrepreneurs who are working in crisis contexts around where that innovation is kind of most needed?
So we've worked with a lot of content providers or people that have like different apps, right? So we work with a group in Eastern Europe when the recent bub up in Armenia, where they had resources for women facing domestic violence, right? And so we were able to work with them to tailor that app or to expand that app to like a bigger geography for people on the move, also tips and tricks to, and just to help bring surface to that. In South America, where people are going up migrating from Venezuela up through the Darien Gap up to the North America. Different tools and products we were putting out. It's like how to safely navigate the Darien Gap and what pitfalls are and what reports have been along the way. And then also working with you guys to just expand your customer base and to think through like how do you get into different channels or how can we partner to do those things. And that's, that's where that flexible cash is needed, but those are exactly the partnerships that get us through. Like we're not trying to ship things in from elsewhere. We're not trying to build things on the fly. It's like, what is there that we can tap into? And we know how to tap in or get to, or how to even figure out where are the most needy populations, who's being neglected, to help get to that with these products and innovations.
I'd like to take a slightly different tack. Agree with all that's great, and I agree. So I don't mean different like I oppose, but if you think about where innovation comes from in your own organizations or companies, it comes from diverse teams. The number of Harvard Business Review, MIT management, they say the most effective teams are diverse teams. What they don't say is the least effective teams are also diverse teams. It's the mediocre middle that are the non-diverse teams. And the differentiating factor is trust, because it takes a lot more work to build trust across a diverse team than a non-diverse team. So we don't have to build trust across a non-diverse team because we went to the same schools, we have the same cultural cues, we speak with the same accents, blah, blah, blah. We're not going to be nearly as creative as a diverse team that has trust, that is bringing all these different perspectives, ideologies, experiences to an issue. And I'm going into that because I want to really reinforce this point about multipartiality being as or even more critical than just local. The amount of work that our teams do around the world to build in DRC, in Myanmar, in Lebanon, we have over almost 1,000 staff in 36 countries in conflict, including my own country in the US. Our team is multiracial and bipartisan, which right now in the US is tough to hold. unfortunately. And it's not a humanitarian crisis situation, but you all, whether you raised your hands as that you work in a humanitarian crisis or not, I would say to all of you that we all work in conflict zones right now. If you look at the Carnegie Endowment report recently that showed levels of polarization in every region of the world have increased faster in the last 10 years than any other 10-year period since 1900, except Europe during World War II. And all of the regions of the world are at higher levels of polarization than any point since 1900, except Europe during World War II. So the reality is, if you're supporting climate action, if you're supporting women's rights, if you're supporting anything, but you're not able to mobilize multi-stakeholder initiatives like Jacinda Ardern told us about last night with the Christchurch call, or your teams are solely on one side of the issue, breaking that issue down into the good guys and the bad guys. And so I think the kind of innovation, I don't mean, that's not against tech innovation and other kinds, but the real innovation, and that's where, when you're dealing with police community relations in London, and your team includes retired police, former gang leaders, community activists that have a lot of constituency, and you build enough trust between them that they're sitting on the same side of the table facing a common problem, and they bring their collective wisdom and they say, I'm sorry, if you use that word, nobody in my community is going to talk to you. If we get something down in that neighborhood, all doors will open to us. And that is the seedbed of real innovation. We call it the common ground approach, but collaborative attacking of shared problems. And if the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is ever going to get resolved, it's going to be people you never would have expected agreeing to things you might not have even wanted to support if you feel strongly about that conflict, who have constituency. And it's going to be ardent Zionists and ardent Palestinian nationalists. It's not going to be people who have been, who find it easy to get along. And so you have to be building that base and supporting that kind of multi-partial activism. So even if you have a leadership development program now, I would argue you should be, rather than saying we are going to support individual leaders, you should be saying, you know what, we'll take applications from pairs who cut across the conflict lines in their society, and we'll build their leadership together. We need that everywhere right now. And relationships should be as important to all of us now as issues. Because any progress we make on issues while eroding trust in relationships will be short-lived at best.
Very interesting.
Can I just say, because I think one of the things from the Rwanda genocide, which I've done a lot of work on afterwards, that came out was that people who'd lived as neighbors for long, many, many years turned on each other. So it was not that they did not have that long kind of collaborative community, all of that. But when power dynamics shift in a way, I think people end up actually, even people you've invested in, have as communities, communities you've even intermarried with, things change. So there's a power dynamic to that transcends what you're talking about. And I think so it's more complex than just pairing up even children or communities, et cetera. And so then you have to think about how you add in that element. And, having interviewed lots of genocide survivors from Rwanda, I always think to myself, there's so many of these gray cases. You're like, what would I have done? It's really hard to judge in those moments what you yourself, or how you would behave. So I would just say it's complex. It's really not just that. There's something more.
I would dispute this a little bit.
Yeah.
I agree with the power dynamics, but my mentor and the founder of our organization, who actually won the Skoll Award, which is the only reason I get to come here because I'm his successor, is John Marks. And he coined a term called Aikido politics. Because in the martial art of Aikido, the goal of the martial art of Aikido is to get both you and your aggressor to a safe space. You go on YouTube and you watch an Aikido master, they never hit anybody. They're deflecting. They exhaust their attacker. In Liberia, under Charles Taylor, the team there came up with the idea of something called Golden Kids News, which was 12-year-olds producing the news that eventually led to the demobilization of child soldiers. All of those young people, and they found, to their surprise, that they could get interviews with colonels in the military and politicians that no adult journalist could get, because they were children. But they could ask them questions that they were actually answering. Almost all of those people went on to become the most effective and frankly feared investigative journalists in that country. They found a way, even in that incredibly oppressive power dynamic. The image of the Afghan woman yesterday, the day after the Taliban took over, everybody was on their WhatsApp phones on the team saying, what are we going to do on Monday? And she said, women, stay home. I'm going to go with the men, see if we can get to the office. They got to the office. As there always has been, there was a police checkpoint 20 feet in front of the entrance, except now it was full of Taliban soldiers. She directed the director of programs. She said, go out and offer them the same thing we offered the police, because it's August, it's very hot. Tell them that if they need it, we have a water spout on the outside of our office. They can use it to fill their canteens. An hour later, these guys all show up. They fill their water spout. They knock on the door. They say, thank you so much. Can we pray in your courtyard? Which put her in a very awkward position. She said, we're a community organization. People were very intimidated by men with guns. Could you maybe just do it for 1 week, but then you have to find an alternative solution? They agreed. Every day since then has been this Aikido politics of neither running away, but also standing with principle, giving respect to and I'm not trying to say it, but I'm talking about people in the midst and on the front lines of it who are working both top down and bottom up, who are accessing political power, not just pairing at communities. I was talking about the leaders. So
when people are fighting for their existential, I think there will always be stories on both sides, but when people are fighting for their existential survival, their better angels don't always take over. And I think it's looking for pathways or looking for things to make it a little less resistant to the bad angels taking over, to kind of help it. But it is a reality, though, that people do turn or things do change, and in those minutes. And there is a reality that some people will step up and do better in those situations, but we have to plan for both.
Ben, I'm going to ask you to take the transitional justice question.
Sure.
We haven't forgotten, because we're running out of time. We did start a few minutes late, so we're going to run a few minutes over, if that's okay, so that we can take a couple more questions and then we'll wrap. But
sure.
If you want to tackle that.
On the international justice question, I think in some ways you sort of answered it. To me, I think that what we're looking at is a whole ecosystem of justice, national justice, regional, international. So you want to look at all levels. So of course, universal jurisdiction, which allows you to bring international norms into national courts, is important. And governments have to actually allow for that in their systems. So that's one place where you can strengthen by getting universal jurisdiction ability to move into courts. It's not in every country. Another way is to have international treaties actually domesticated. It's not a given that you can prosecute a genocide crime in a national jurisdiction without that. So you want to, before a conflict starts, see how we can invest in doing that. You then also want to see then at the international courts how you strengthen it. To my mind, in terms of when prosecution is brought at the international level, because it's so rife with the geopolitics of the globe, it really has, you see a lot of it depends on the will of the prosecutor, the political will to actually brave some of the international politics to bring a case or not bring a case, and you see that in how cases get brought forward or not brought forward. And so there was a moment in time where the only cases the ICC had were African cases, as if there were only violations in Africa. You want to build the norm, the normative. So pushing for the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty now, I think, is a good step forward, and that's going to be a big effort. You want to be careful how you reopen these Bretton Woods documents, because the possibility of weakening them is very much there. If we open the Refugee Convention today, we're likely to get a less strong treaty than what we have now, even though it's flawed. So you want to build incrementally, but again, very creative lawyering to do it. You want to also look, as cases come in, you want to make sure that you can't assume, and this is what I've seen in my experience, that judges from national jurisdictions get promoted into international benches. It doesn't necessarily mean they know the international law well, and investing in training judges and helping judges understand creatively what they could be doing, and even understanding the treaty bodies that they're working with, is important. Quality of judges, quality of lawyers, defense and prosecution, also important. I've seen cases where the quality of the lawyering is bad, and that actually damages the international law. The last thing is that you want your investigators to come in well-trained. I've done a lot of work, particularly on sexual violence documentation and crimes, and where prosecution of rape is hampered by extremely bad investigators who are either embarrassed to ask questions of rape or don't think that rape is a serious crime under international law. So making sure that the people who are actually getting the evidence, because a prosecutor who receives a bad docket with weak evidence is not going to want to go in the courtroom. And then they drop the case, and then you lose the chance of justice. So you actually, at all levels of the ecosystem, have to make sure this is done. And even for universal jurisdiction, you want the national jurisdiction lawyers to understand, and again, from my experience with sexual violence, in a national jurisdiction, rape is a crime that usually requires, as elements, penetration and consent. Those are two very key elements you find in all national jurisdictions. Under international law, because it's a coercive environment, the issue of consent is a non-starter. So you can say, well, why did these women stay with these fighters for 3 months or 2 months? Why didn't they run away? In a coercive environment, consent is not an element. Types of sexual violence in conflict go beyond penetration. There's very violent ways in which sexuality is attacked in conflict situations. And again, a national judge would not find those as qualifying, but under international law. This is just one example, but educating people on how international criminal law is different from national is also, again, very key. So investing in everything so that by the time you get into the courtroom, you're not trying to fix things. And then in conflict situations, you're dealing with people who are very traumatized, genocide victims, people who've lost everything, people who've lost their family. You want them to get up on the stand to win your case as a lawyer, but you have to also be conscious of the fact that they're coming with a lot of their own, they've lost everything in their lives, and they're coming to testify in a case. So how it's done and how you make a courtroom that is actually sensitive and actually services the very people we say these international cases are for has to be thought about. It's not just the judgments.
I know we are over time, but you already have the microphone in your hand, so I'm going to...
We get this one on. I know there are so many questions, and we're so grateful for such a rich conversation. Unfortunately, we have another session happening here very soon. So please remember the faces of those who have had their hands up, because we don't want the conversation to end here. We know that this could go on all day and that there's so much more to talk about. So please take advantage of the spaces, the tents outside, the courtyard marquee, and the collaboration cafe to continue the conversation. Find each other on the app to continue asking the questions. And I'm so sorry to have to cut us off in this moment. Thank you all.
Okay.